All right then. We're the three-part trilogy. This one's rough, but it's good. It's going to be broken up into three parts because I used a lot of words. If you had never seen yourself, would you recognize yourself in a picture? But I guess if you had never seen yourself, then you probably lived in a time without water or reflection pools or shiny things that sat on a shelf and wait to stare back at you. Maybe then we would know ourselves from the light in others' eyes, the reflections of happiness when we walk into a room, the way the stories are told about us. It's the stories that catch up with me. Each line on my face is part of the story. The bleary red eyes staring back at me this morning tell me another story. If today's eyes are a window to the soul, there's little light in this basement. Get out. Get the fuck out right now. Now. Her arm shook as her finger propelled toward the door. Her eyes, usually a light blue, now strained red with anger. Even from the couch, I could feel the heat. I sat there comfortably with a magazine in one hand, beverage in the other, and until a few seconds ago, rather peacefully enjoying my day. The house was still filled with the cool morning breeze. The lights from the skylights filtered down, giving the room a calmness, allowing the dust to come to rest and the quiet to take a breath. I had been selling real estate for a year when we met. We met online, then met at a bar. I was sitting at the bar, nervously sipping a whiskey, trying not to look like the guy sitting at a bar, nervously sipping a whiskey, waiting for a woman who he talked to once on the phone, then to agreed to meet after work on Tuesday. It was Tuesday, and I was early. I had walked around the block a couple of times to burn off some energy and figure out what to say to someone after reading 500 words, answering 100 questions, and talking for 5 minutes. This was my first foray into the dating world as a middle aged guy. I had been with my previous girlfriend, can we call her an ex, for 15 years prior to this, and had hoped never to date again, but here I am, trying to be cool via the internet. The door opened and I glanced towards the sound of an incoming conversation. It was a couple in a heated conversation. She pushed the door open and as he was walking in, turned around to him, halting his progress, his hands straining to keep the door open, and said something serious. I didn't hear what she said, but he didn't have anything to say back. From behind them, he heard a sound, turned, and flattened himself against the door as she walked past. Thanks, she said, catching the girlfriend's eye and winking once. She strode confidently across the room in knee-high leather boots and jeans. It was still cold, and the leather biker's jacket wore her like she was made for it. But it was the smile that got me. She slid onto the bar stool next to me while unwinding the scarf, letting her red hair fall from her shoulders, framing her red, Irish freckled countenance. She didn't carry a purse. The conversation started with the usual, "Hi, how are you? Nice to finally meet you." Like I'd been waiting all my years to be here at this bar at this moment, nervously being early. I'd finished my first whiskey, and the barman had taken the glass, leaving only water to be sipped on. The barman saw her and waved he'd be over in a minute. It's amazing how women can get a barman's attention by just sitting down, and I have to go through the whole primal bar pantomime. That night we drank whiskey, went to a pool hall, ate sushi, and ended up at her place. I hadn't been with another woman yet, and was hoping that everything would work. You'd hate to get this far and blow it, excuse the pun, the first time out. Luckily, the whiskey and late night left us both tired, and we talked for a while until we fell asleep on the couch. When I awoke, she wasn't there. I figured she had moved to her bed, and maybe it was a good time for me to head out the door. As I was gathering my coat, I realized my car was still downtown. Had we taken her car or a taxi? The green numbers on the stove said 6:15, and it was still dark outside. A perfect time to slide out the door, get a cab, and be home in a few minutes. "Good morning!" I froze in the darkness. One boot on, the other still tied stuck, my foot jammed by the laces. "Good morning," I said back, turning and trying to smile through the growing whiskey hangover. I was caught. She turned on the stairwell light and stood at the landing wearing only an old Grateful Dead t-shirt, and looking from below, I could see nothing else. Her bare feet padded silently down the steps to the first step so we could see face to face. I walked, well hobbled, with my foot still wiggling into my boot, and slowly slid my hand around her waist as she leaned toward me. The first kiss is always the most delicate, the most refined. The rest of the morning and into the next day we shared hot breath and primal passion as we explored each other only to lay wrapped together in our own new funkiness. The next morning, as she stood on her toes to kiss me once more, I thought, briefly, if now would be a good time to ask her name. I thought of her, months later, as the red Spanish dust poured out of my boot. The day was passing and the wind continued blowing flat sheets of dust and sand across the road, the small rocks bouncing and skipping with the dust. Lacing up my boots and shouldering my pack, I looked for the yellow arrow that marks the Camino. That's how we find our way across 500 miles of track, path, road, and city streets, the yellow arrows. A few years later, I was sitting in a bar, staying out of the 100-degree Valencian heat on a different Camino, and heard the story of the yellow arrows that guided the pilgrims safely to Santiago. The old man has sat down next to me and pointed to the shell on my pack. The shell is the sign of the pilgrim. Mine was tied to the pack with a red ribbon given to me by the priest in Sevilla during the pilgrim's blessing. He stared at his empty wine glass as the barman stood a few feet away with the bottle in hand. I got the impression I was buying and nodded as he filled the glass with fresh Tinto wine. The old guy sat there for a few minutes. The barman had lit a cigarette and leaned on the counter watching the football match on the TV over the bar. I was waiting for something to happen, something with a little wow. The condensation on my glass was paying little attention to the old man when he spoke quietly into the wine. Pinte las flechas en la calle. I painted the arrows on the road. Yeah, I didn't get that, but nodded my head knowingly as if contemplating something profound. The knowing nod is a handy tool when you don't understand what's going on, but don't want to look like you don't understand what's going on. The old man started telling a story. I thought it was a story. Maybe he had been praying, but my Spanish couldn't understand what he was saying either way. He kept telling the story, I kept nodding, the barman kept smoking, but his gaze shifted to me and the old man. Habla español, he said. That one I understood. Un poco, a little, I said. The old man stopped talking. His gaze had shifted to the TV. He was a peregrino, the barman said, pointing to the old man. Long ago. I looked at the old man. He could have been 60 aged into an old by red Tito wine, or a soul of 90 having seen the worst of Franco and his rule, now sitting lonely, sharing wine with the lost ghosts of the past. What did he say? I asked in English, hoping the barman could tell the story for him. The barman stubbed out a cigarette and leaned on the bar close to me. He struggled for the word. Arroway? How do you say in English? The words sound like arrow and A. Hero, I said. Hero, un luchador, a fighter contra Franco and La Basque. ETA. He looked at me as if I understood. The day had taken a serious turn from the happy Camino into Spain's violent past. The somber mood filtered into the bar. The old man stared at the TV, not seeing the game, but living in another time. He said something in a language I couldn't understand. I didn't know what ETA was, but knew the Basque region had fought for its own sovereignty. Franco had crushed anyone who stood in his way. The old man said something again, this time in Spanish, and its message was clear. El caudillo dijeron que éramos terroristas. I understood. To some, he was a hero of Spain. To the ruthless dictator, a terrorist.